Good afternoon, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens Let's Talk Gardens. We appreciate your support by coming to our webinars. We appreciate your support by visiting our gardens if you can, and we also appreciate your support. You will get a link to a sustainability survey that we're sending out, and this is part of a bigger survey that is being overseen by the American Public Garden Association. And public gardens all over are very concerned about our messages and how we're sharing them with others and who is actually learning about these messages. So if you would please fill that out for us when you're sent the link, we'd greatly appreciate it. My name is Cindy Brown. I'm the Education, Collections, and Access Manager at Smithsonian Gardens, and I'm very glad to have you with us today. As always, if you would please put your questions in the chat box, I'll be glad to share it with our speaker after she finishes her presentation, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. Sometimes, we run over and don't have much time for questions. So if your question is in the chat box, I will always send it to Sarah to be able to answer afterwards. And then I'll get back to you on the answers. But today we are very privileged to have Dr. Sarah Via, a professor and climate extension specialist. So Sarah, thank you for joining us today on Let's Talk Gardens. We appreciate this information because we all want to be better gardeners. We all want to do the very best that we can, and we'll be very anxious for you to tell us how to do that. Not as a gardener, as a green thumb gardener, but as a gardener that is concerned for our future in all of our gardens. So I'm going to disappear, but I'll be back and help you out with the questions. Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much, Cindy. I really appreciate the invitation and the chance to talk to all of you about how you can make your own landscape, whether it's suburban or urban or rural, part of the climate solution. I will be very happy to answer your questions. I'm going to try to be self-disciplined and not go over my time here so I can leave a bunch of time for questions, but I'll answer them even if we don't get to them during the webinar. I'll answer them in writing. So thanks very much. I just want to tell you a little bit about climate change before we get going, because this is sort of an important backdrop on why we care about the way that we landscape our yards. It's very, very hard to detect climate change, as you all know, just in the present, because weather is so variable and we get very overwhelmed by that variability. So we need long-term data to see climate change. And here is some long-term data starting before 1860 and up through 2021. And what these red dots are, they are the average temperature across the whole globe. Okay, so it's a very sort of generalized average. And the bars are just the variability around that average for a given year. So each dot is 1 year, and we have all that data for, all these many years. So what you can see is, here's this red line basically reflecting that this is variability that's mostly just occurring around what we would call the pre-industrial average. Although the Industrial Revolution started here and we started to get increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it really doesn't start to register in the temperature for a few years after that. So what we can see is, here's the pre-industrial temperature, which has been set to 0. So that's the starting point. And there's some variability in here. There's a little bit of high temperature during the 40s, which is due to something else, not to climate change. But once we get to about 1970, you can see that there's just a relentless upward movement of global average temperature. And when you look at the last 7 years shown here, these are the hottest that we've had since the 1860s. And it represents, well, this line shows 1.2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial average. So we're really even 1.3, if you look at the average of these points, 1.3 degrees centigrade above. If you've been watching the news at all, then you know that scientists say that we do not want to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. We're already at 1.3. This means we need action pretty much right now. So why is it getting so hot? This is just a basic explanation of the greenhouse effect, which everyone has heard of, but a surprisingly small number of people can actually explain. The greenhouse effect is something that happens in the atmosphere. This is a little cartoon from the Climate Reality Project. It shows the atmosphere as this space here. It's much bigger in this cartoon than it is in real life. It's very, very thin. It's just maybe 7 to 10 miles thick layer around the Earth. And this is where all the action happens. This is where the oxygen is and everything, that all the gases that we need on Earth. What has happened is that we have altered the composition of the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And then there are other sources of greenhouse gases. The main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, that's what comes from domesticated animals and from melting permafrost, and nitrous oxide, which mostly comes from fertilizer production. And so what happens is the sun shines down on the Earth, warms it up, okay, no surprise. And then the heat is radiated back into space, goes through the atmosphere as infrared waves, okay, like from an infrared light in your bathroom, heat waves. But the heat waves do not necessarily go directly out into space. They are affected by levels of these three gases. These are special gases that interfere with the trajectory of these heat waves. So when a heat wave runs into one of these special gases, it's briefly absorbed and then bounces off in some random direction. So the more of these greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere, the more bouncing around of the heat waves occurs before they get out into space. So the bottom line here is the more greenhouse gas molecules we release into the atmosphere, the slower the heat loss, the more warming we have. Totally simple. This is all anybody needs to understand to know why greenhouse gases affect the temperature, why climate change is occurring, and why we need to reduce the emissions of these gases. Okay, so this is the climate problem. There is no scientific controversy about this. We know, and 99% of scientists that have anything to do with earth science or greenhouse gases or climate or weather all agree that the warming from the increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide is already causing serious impacts on our weather, ecosystems, water availability. This last year has been a real ramp up of impacts. Hurricane Ian, much more devastating, as have been many recent hurricanes because of climate change. The drought that we've had in the West, aggravated by climate change, flooding in Pakistan, aggravated. It's all really starting to affect us in very visible and local ways. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in this past May was 421 parts per million, which is 1.5 times what it was during the pre-industrial time. So this is a big thing. This picture shows warming across the globe relative to that pre-industrial level, except right here in the North Atlantic, where we have cold water dripping off of the Greenland ice sheet. We have a big cold glob. This is a concern in itself, but another story. So for the best future, we need to reduce emissions and remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that's the first of the problems I want to discuss today. We have a problem with soil. Our soil worldwide has been seriously degraded by conventional agricultural practices. And the ability of our soil to soak up, to hold, and purify water has been greatly reduced by practices like tillage. And this leads to the next problem, the water problem. The microbial communities in the soil have also been seriously degraded, and this reduces the ability of soil to sort of participate in what's called nutrient cycling. That is the decomposition of things, dead stuff, that releases the nutrients that are locked up in them when they were living. So those nutrients are used over and over again. And that doesn't work very well when we compromise the microbial population. It requires that farmers use more fertilizers and chemicals because not enough nutrients are being released naturally, and this contributes to the water problem as well. And finally, habitat for natural enemies and pollinators is lost. It really is barely visible in large agricultural landscapes. This is a problem for pollination, but it also increased the presence and damaging nature of insect pests. So this is part of the biodiversity problem. In case you thought that dust storms were only occurring in the Dust Bowl, this is a recent picture from Kansas, where you can see that when farmers till and leave a field unprotected like this, it's very easy for the wind to just pick up the soil and carry it away. Or for water, this is a cornfield that was planted in tilled soil, for water to carry the topsoil away. And that's a huge loss of a very valuable product. Okay, the water problem. Our streams and coastal waters are polluted by chemicals, pathogens, and sediment, as well as by nutrient runoff, which comes from fertilizer and manure. And this nutrient runoff is a huge problem because when you send a lot of extra nitrogen and phosphorus down to a body of water, that creates a dead zone. So we have a dead zone in Chesapeake Bay. There's a gigantic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And in fact, the Union of Concerned Scientists would publish this map. This shows nitrogen load in waterways in these different states. These are the big farming states in the center of the country. And runoff of nitrogen from fertilizer has, of course, gone right down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. But the shocking thing is it has cost Gulf fishermen up to $2.8 billion a year for the last 30 years in the sort of reduction of viable fisheries. This is really, I think, shocking. With climate change, we're getting more heavy rains, higher sea level, we're getting more inland and coastal flooding, more erosion and runoff. So this, of course, is then interacting with the soil problem. Everything we put on our yards runs down onto the streets, into the gutters, and then eventually into the nearest body of water. And I just read today, I think that the most recent look at the Chesapeake Bay indicates that we are not even close to our goals for reducing nutrient runoff into the bay. As climate change proceeds, we have more summer heat, we have hotter streams. That's also a problem when they're polluted, and we have more drought. So it's just, you know, the water problem, too much water or not enough water. We never seem to have exactly the right amount of water anymore. And finally, the biodiversity problem. We've had a dramatic loss of habitat and biodiversity from development, climate change, and agriculture. And in our landscaping, you know, I'm talking mostly suburban, but most rural households have large expanses of grass too. Our reliance on mowed turf grass as sort of the main feature of our landscapes has been associated with huge habitat loss and a great big loss of insect biodiversity. So the loss of birds as well as insects. Well, of course, we lose birds when we don't have enough insects for insectivorous birds to feed their young. In this introduced monoculture threatens our ecosystem functions and again allows pests to increase and reduces pollination. So what are we going to do about it? I think we need to rethink our suburban landscapes and embrace practices that first and foremost restore the soil. And in so doing, these will also help sequester carbon. We can reduce emissions by every means possible, and that will help solve the climate problem. Better soil will increase infiltration and reduce flooding. Healthy soil also holds more water, so that if you have a brief period of drought, there's some water there for plants to utilize. And the soil does an amazing amount of purification of water. There's a ton of microbes in the soil that actually eat chemical pesticides and break them down and do, really good things. Pathogens are purified. So when we have water soaking in, that water gets purified. When it runs off, not so much, goes right down to the bay. And we need to rebuild bird and insect populations to get our biodiversity back. How are we going to do this? Reduce lawn and increase native perennials. So that's what the rest of this talk is about. Okay, lawn is the default landscape. The ideal home, as shown to us here in this picture from Ryan Homes, who's a big home builder in Maryland, includes this giant expanse of manicured lawn. There's this little, this sort of a rainbow and sunrise over here, make it look really perfect. So this is the, what we think this is what we are supposed to think is the ideal for our home. And there's a long history of lawn as a symbol of sort of wealth and home ownership. It conveys the idea that, I am in such good shape financially or whatever, that I don't need to grow plants or have a landscape that actually produces anything. I can just have this, lawn that produces nothing, because of course we get no fiber or food or anything valuable from our lawn. Lawns don't require too much thought to choose and install. If I'm a child of the suburbs, I grew up in a suburb outside Detroit. Everybody had a lawn. Everybody's father cut the grass, or their brothers cut the grass, and it was just sort of the way that we grew up. The upkeep of lawn is thus very familiar to most suburban residents. Okay, now urban settings where people have little tiny lawns or no lawns at all, this is a little bit of a different story, but there's just zillions of acres. I'll tell you exactly how many in the next slide, I think. An awful lot of lawn out there. The other thing about lawn is that you can hire it out. You can hire the lawn care out to a company, which is more than happy to cut your lawn and put fertilizer, et cetera, on it for a fee. And lawn is also the most common municipal and commercial landscape. So office parks are filled with lawn, and municipal settings are filled with lawn. But there's a real dark side of lawn when it comes to the environmental and economic impacts. So the environmental cost of lawn, there are 42 million acres of lawn in the US. This makes lawn our largest irrigated crop. There's more acres of lawn than corn and soybeans put together. In Maryland alone, there's 1.3 million acres of lawn. Just for a moment, think in your mind, how many acres of crops are there in Maryland? I'm going to tell you, 1.3 million acres. There's as much lawn as cropland in Maryland. Across the US, lawn uses between 30 and 50% of our municipal water, which is becoming a more and more limited resource in many parts of the country. Yard tools, gasoline and diesel-powered yard tools contribute or cause 5% of all US greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is only 14%. So this is a big amount of our greenhouse gas emissions. Well-meaning people filling up their lawnmowers and weed whackers spill 17 million gallons of fuel, at least. This is a sort of old figure, maybe 10 or 15 years old. Spill all this fuel per year that then evaporates and or goes down into the waterways. Lawns are very frequently over-fertilized. NO3 is nitrate. It's a soluble form of the nitrogen that you would put on from, say, Scott's fertilizer or any artificial or synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And N2O is nitrous oxide. It's a gas. And when you apply fertilizer, microbes in the soil convert some of it to nitrous oxide, and then it goes up as a gas into the air. Nitrous oxide is something like 380 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So a little bit of this goes a very long way. The shocking thing to me, I thought this was shocking when I learned it, was that 10 times more nitrogen and chemical runoff comes from lawns per acre than from agricultural fields. Now, I think farmers sort of get a bum rap on this, because in Maryland, at least, farmers have to have a nutrient management plan where they, actually account for how much fertilizer they put on and where it goes. And although University of Maryland Extension tries to encourage homeowners to calibrate their spreaders and whatnot. It's not that easy. And I don't think most people do it. Just guessing. I tried to follow the rules and do it on my spreader. And, it took me like an hour, and I think most people aren't going to do it. So most people just say, I've got this bag, I'm using it all up, whether they need it or not. So lawn, as you all know, is a monoculture of, maybe there's 2 or 3 species of introduced species of tall fescue, and it's a very poor habitat, and pretty much nothing except lawn grubs lives in this. And the problem is that there are so many chemical and fertilizer amendments that we are encouraged to put on our lawn. I mean, all you have to do is go to Lowe's or Home Depot and just check out the amount of real estate in the store devoted to stuff to put on your lawn, either to, make it grow better, fertilizer, or to kill stuff. So because of that, lawn contributes to all 4 of our key environmental problems. Let's talk about yard equipment for a minute. Yard equipment is very inefficient and is responsible for a lot of emissions, as I pointed out. I got some interesting information from the California Air Resources Board about how many yard tools there are in California and how much they are emitting. So California has 13.7 million passenger vehicles. Well, okay, there's about that many pieces of yard equipment, 12.9 million residential lawnmowers, weed whackers, leaf blowers, blah, 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 and another 1.5 million in commercial lawn and garden. In other words, there's pretty much as many yard tools as cars in California. What about emissions from these yard tools? Well, cars have become much more efficient. And so as time has worn on, we're only here, right? As time has worn on, and then this is the projection, there'll be less and less smog forming emissions, greenhouse gases coming from cars. Yard tools, they're not going anywhere. And although people are trying to electrify, et cetera, the great majority of yard tools will not be electric for many, many years. So California predicts much more emissions, climate change emissions from yard tools than cars in the future. How much does a lawnmower actually emit? So again, this is from the same website. 1 hour of lawnmower use, lawnmowers are now more efficient than they used to be, is like driving 300 miles, a Toyota Camry, 300 miles from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. Okay, 1 hour of lawnmower use. 1 hour of leaf blower use, this blew me away, is much worse. It's like driving that same car 1,100 miles. So next time you see somebody out there blowing blowing their leaves off their driveway, or blowing the little bits of grass that come out of their lawnmower onto their driveway, that is one of the most polluting tools ever. And I really like to encourage people to just, put their leaf blower away or get an electric one. Okay. What does it cost you to take care of your lawn? Okay. Back when I was giving talks in person, I would ask people in the audience, what was the last time you actually thought about what it is costing you to take care of your lawn? How much time you're spending, how much money you're spending. I got these figures off of the internet a year or so ago, and I think they're tremendous underestimates. If you mow the lawn yourself, you've got to buy all the equipment. I'd like to buy a John Deere lawnmower for $1,500. I don't think you're going to find one around here for that. Leaf blowers and weed eaters, cost money. Plus, you've got to maintain them, either change the oil and do all that stuff yourself, spend your own time, or take it to some place and have them fix it. And I don't know where most of you are, but I'm in suburban Maryland, and I can tell you that nothing happens. No fixing or maintenance happens for less than a few $100s per year. Plus, you got to buy the fertilizer, herbicides, or insecticides if you use that stuff. You need to buy gas, and it takes a lot of time. A lot of people spend the great majority of their weekend cutting the grass or taking care of it. Or you can hire a lawn service. this is another great underestimate. I got a big round of laughter in a talk I gave where I showed this this figure. The average lawn mowing price for half an acre is $45. I don't think you could get somebody to mow the strip between your sidewalk and the road for $45 in Maryland. But anyway, this is a national average. But most people have their grass cut 30 times a year. So whatever this figure is, times 30 is what you're paying per year. $13.50 to me seems like a lot, even at $45. So I think around here it's more like $90. Anyway, it costs a lot, and you have to buy all the stuff too. The lawn companies want you to get on their fertilizer plan, and they want you to core aerate and do other things and put insecticides and herbicides and fungicides down, pre-emergent, post-emergent, whatever. And so they get you on these programs, and this winds up costing a lot. Now, one thing that I was not aware of until recently is this deal with patterns in the lawn. I noticed that my neighbor has this crisscross pattern in her lawn. I'm thinking, what does she have that for? Like this. You can go on the internet and find all these wacky patterns you can mow into your lawn. Well, okay, what does that actually mean? Most of them require that the lawnmower go over the lawn more than one time. That means even more emissions and time than it would take to actually just cut the grass. So to all those, any of you out there who might enjoy these lawn patterns, just recognize that this is costing you money, and it is increasing the carbon dioxide emissions from lawn mowing in order to achieve some pattern. Okay, now what about open space? I live in Howard County, Maryland, and according to our utilities guys, there's about 4,000 acres of mowed turf grass outside of parks. Okay, so all this, there's sports fields, etc., but they're not even counting the sports fields. It's just this sort of space that's out there. When you drive around and you really think, how much grass is out there? There's a lot of grass out there. It's all over the place, and somebody has to mow it. In Howard County, the open space grass is mowed every 1 to 2 weeks, every 1 week for spaces that are very close to where people are watching. People don't like to see anything that looks like it's not being taken care of every moment. Other places, maybe you can wait 2 weeks. I forgot to mention, Howard County as a whole on county property has 4,000 acres. Columbia, Maryland, which was within Howard County, has an additional 1,600 acres of mowed turf grass. So in order to do all this mowing, of course, it's producing emissions from thousands of gallons of diesel. Tons of fertilizer and chemicals are put on this, and the ballpark cost I have the information on this I've received. The Columbia Association told me it cost them $750 an acre annually, and this is not counting personnel because they have people on salary. Howard County contracts this out. They spend $2,000 an acre annually to take care of 4,000 acres, which sounds like around $8 million per year to cut the grass. Open space could be part of the climate solution instead of part of the climate problem. And, we could have situations like this where some of the median on this boulevard is mowed, but a lot of it is native plants, and water's directed to that, and the soil is, improving, and water's being filtered, etc. So this is like a big win. Okay, now why does lawn need so much maintenance? This is a classic picture that's been, published many, many times. I got it from this journal, but it shows the root structure of a variety of native plants, grasses, and forbs. Forbs are plants with showy flowers. And here's lawn. So here's the surface. Here's the surface right here. Lawn has roots that are about like this, a few inches deep. Okay. These native plants have roots that go down, maybe the shortest would be 4 feet, or, the longest 10 or 15 feet. These plants are reaching down and able to gather water and nutrients from a far greater area than that grass in your backyard. So I think of lawn as like the infant of of plants because it can't do anything for itself. It can't get water because it doesn't have very many, roots. It can't really pick up a lot of nutrients from the soil, again, because it doesn't have much roots. So you have to give it everything. You have to give it water. You have to give it nutrients. And that seems like, a big price to pay for this sort of conventional landscape. What can we do to minimize the costs of lawn? Now, there's a couple approaches to reducing lawn impact. I know a lot of you are master gardeners, and so you've thought about this a lot yourself. One thing that you can do is you can just remove your lawn, okay, and replace it with native plants. Now, this is okay for experienced gardeners, master gardeners or people who love gardening. But it can be hugely threatening to tell someone that in order to have a sustainable yard, you've got to take out your lawn. I mean, if you have just a very tiny yard, it maybe isn't a very daunting impact, but it's scary to a lot of people. This is a backyard landscape from a woman who lived, I think, in Easton. I met her when I gave a talk at her garden club. And she showed me these pictures of this progress of her, she removed all the lawn. She doesn't have a very big yard. She removed all the lawn. She made a plan, okay? She planted all these native plants. She made white clover or micro clover paths in between. Here are the native plants. It looks beautiful, okay? It was a lot of work. Most people are not going to be willing to do that. And it's very difficult to say to people, the only way that you can be really responsibly managing your yard is to remove the lawn. That just is very hard for people to hear. I tell people this: accept imperfection. Don't require your lawn to be perfect. Now, my mom really loved the lawn, okay? She had a guy come, he put all kinds of chemicals down, he was mowing the thing, he was like trimming it all the time. It was perfect. Everything was the same height. And, she had to put a lot of fertilizer and chemicals on it to make that happen. My attitude is, so what? So if there's a few weeds, I don't care. I'm not gonna get all worried about it. If the lawn goes brown in the summer, it's dormant. You don't need to water it, just maybe every few weeks to make sure it stays alive, but you don't need to keep it green because dormancy is natural. You can mow high with a mulching mower. By high, I mean like 4 inches, and then return the clippings, which is allows for nutrient cycling. And this is part of my backyard, which has a lot of clover, a lot of violets. But my motto is, if it's green, I mow it. Gives me a place to play, fetch with my dog and run around, and I'm not too worried about it. So you can accept imperfection. All the way down to something like this, which I would say most people would not even regard as acceptable, but yeah, it's okay with me. Or you can find a substitute, which is going to look like lawn, but is more climate friendly. And I call this the lawn mimic, okay? And I'll talk to you about that for the next few minutes. So lawn mimics maintain that look of expanse of green that's, short and looks maintained. And I'm going to tell you about some experiments I've done to try to develop some protocols for growing these plants. The lawn mimics that I've worked with are a mix of low and slow growing grasses, fine fescues, which is different from tall fescue, which is the typical lawn grass, plus optional microclover or white clover, which adds nitrogen, okay? I know a lot of people are not too enthusiastic about putting clover in their lawn because they, if you're allergic to bee stings and you run around your lawn barefoot, well, that is a problem. But I don't go around in my lawn barefoot, so I don't worry about it too much. This is an example of a yard in Columbia, Maryland, David Alexander's yard. I met David at a master naturalist training in Columbia, and I guess I gave a talk about these fine fescues. And so he went home. He has a pretty small lot, but he went home and he took out all the rest of his grass and planted fine fescue, a mix of fine fescue and micro clover. And he planted a nice micro clover border next to the street. This was about 3 years ago. This looks even better now. What I've learned is over time, these fine fescue grasses develop a very dense root system, and they come up very thick, so they crowd out weeds very, very effectively. And he, I think, overseeded, did core aerating and overseeded once, and his yard looks absolutely great. My yard, well, not so much. This is along the driveway of my property where I planted some of this fine fescue. Here it's mowed to about 5 inches. I think this looks completely acceptable as lawn. Here's where I let it grow. The blades are about 10 inches now, so it'll grow and flop over. And I think this is okay. Certainly this would be okay in like an open space setting where people aren't, walking right by it and, say, oh, look, this is longer than 4 inches. But you only have to mow this stuff, even to keep it, looking like this, maybe 8 times a year. Okay, instead of 30 times, okay, which is a big, big improvement. You can do even less, 10 to 20% as much mowing, depending on whether you can tolerate this. So the roots of fine fescues, which are also introduced, are a little deeper than regular tall fescue, but we're not planting this as a climate solution to store carbon in the soil. We're planting this to reduce mowing, because remember, lawn equipment contributes 5% of our greenhouse gases each year. So you can get up to 80% less carbon dioxide emissions if you don't mow as often, okay? I was lucky enough to be able to work with some people from the Columbia Association in Howard County. In 2020, we received a Howard County Innovation Grant, and this was right at the beginning of the pandemic. So I did all of the experiments at my house. I have 3 acres and a big garden, and so I gave over some of the space to plots of different mixes of various fine fescues. This was the November of the first year that I planted it. I did plant some in the spring. It's very hard to get good grass to grow in the spring, so that was a bust. But I planted this in September of 2020. In November, it looked like this. Each one of these is a separate mix, and there's a couple copies. And then the next spring, it looked like this. Again, I think it still looks pretty darn good. Here's my garden back there. And then in September of last year, it still looked pretty good. I stopped maintaining it, so it doesn't look as good as this now. I also planted some individual single species plots just to see what things look like. This is red fescue, hard fescue, slender creeping red fescue, sheep's fescue. And here's some other, these are native plants, Agrastis tenuis. Oh, and this is Agrastis stolonifera, sorry. And here's a few native plants which didn't come up very well, but I wanted to see what they look like by themselves. And they essentially, all of the fine fescues grew great in the sun, in the shade. They all did very well. So that's all I'm going to say about the lawn mimics. They can be a little bit hard to get started in your yard. I'm still working on some protocols for, that I could hand out to people for how to do it. But once they get established, they're really, really great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about increasing the use of native perennials in landscape beds. So compared to using just annuals, planting native perennials saves resources and time and reduces your carbon footprint. If you go to, Lowe's or Home Depot or someplace and buy annuals every year, here they are, they're beautiful, but you're buying them in, plastic containers, which could be recycled, but which most people do not recycle. They're in peat-based mix, so that, peat moss is not a very climate-friendly material. And, you got to buy them every year and spend time, going to the store and planting them. If you plant perennials, hey, it's a miracle, but they come up every darn year. This is my favorite thing because I always feel I never have enough time to do anything. So if these plants want to come back every year without me doing anything, I'm all over that. Native plants are going to increase biodiversity and pollinators, which is great. The deep-rooted native plants, as I showed you on that slide previously, sequester carbon. They help manage stormwater, and you can use them all over the place in different kinds of settings. So you can plant native plants in containers. Now, of course, they're not going to sequester carbon in containers, but they're going to attract a lot of pollinators and be very good for insect biodiversity. Here's a nice native planting at a National Park Service ferry dock somewhere. This is near a ball field in a city park. This is outside, I think, Chicago or some other urban area where an abandoned area had been planted to native plants. This beautiful place is the former office headquarters of Annapolis Green. Elvia Thompson gave me this picture, and she had a beautiful area. They've since moved. I don't know exactly what's become of this, but it was certified by National Wildlife Federation as a pollinator garden. So, native plants can be very beautiful and not that hard to incorporate. Now, if you want to turn a large area into a meadow, that can be a little challenging. Planting a meadow from seed, I would say, is not for the beginner. It requires a lot of site prep, site preparation, and some, pretty sophisticated planting equipment. You can't just go out to an area that might be grass and toss a bunch of seed out there and think anything's going to happen. You have to make sure you get rid of a lot of the weed seeds in the seed bank, and that can require a whole year of preparation before you do planting. So I would not encourage anybody to plant an area that's bigger than 100 square feet with just seed, because it can be very disappointing. You also need to mow these meadows every year at increasing heights, like 5 inches, maybe the first year, then 10 inches. Well, nobody has a residential lawnmower that's going to mow at 10 inches, so it becomes a little difficult. I would urge people who are putting native plants in at their house to use plants or plugs. Plugs are just, flats that have, soil and plants in them. You have a lot more control over what you get in your landscape if you put it in as plants or plugs. And a meadow is typically 40% grasses and 60% forbs. That is these things with showy flowers. Grasses are flowering plants, so that's why I say showy flowers, because grasses have flowers, but they're wind pollinated. If you plant from, here's a plug flat. Here's a couple of plug flats. If you plant from plugs, you can control what goes in there. And you don't have to worry about what's germinating or when it's going to germinate, but you still have to worry about weeds. So we did another experiment in the Howard County Innovation Grant about weed control in perennial beds, because many municipalities, I think, would like to plant more native plants, but in general, planting perennial beds requires a lot of hand weeding, and of course, this dissuades municipalities from going down that road because it takes too much time. So we compared a couple of different treatments. Again, this was the pandemic, so I set up a plot in my former garden, and there were 6 plots here. We tested bare ground. This area this was a former pasture. It had been under a tarp for about 6 months, so all of the existing plants were dead, but there were still weed seeds in there. Bare ground was one of the treatments. I planted through this horticultural paper, and I'll explain that more in a minute. And then we interseeded with red clover. That didn't work at all, so I'm not going to talk about it. So I'm going to compare bare ground, which is like this, and planting through this paper, which is like this. So I found this awesome tool called the Pro Plugger. Now, I don't like to crouch, so this is the perfect tool for me, because I had these little plots. I think there were like 80 plants in each one. I don't know. I forget, actually. But I could just go down here and make holes for the plugs with this Pro Plugger, which makes a like a 2.5-inch hole. And you can control the depth with the ring you put down there. You just stomp on it and you get a plug. And you can I could do a whole row like this without stopping, because the plugs, the soil that comes up just goes up here into the core and you dump it out very fast. So I made this little grid. For the bare ground, I just left it as the grid. For the paper, I put these sheets of this great stuff called Weed Guard or Weed Guard Plus. It's horticultural paper. It's about the weight of a grocery bag, so it's heavier than newspaper. And it comes in rolls that are 2, 3, or 4 feet wide and up to 100 feet long. So it's really awesome. I also use it in my garden. where I have 4-foot wide beds that are maybe like 50 feet long. So I just unroll one of these rolls and plant my plants through there. It turns out the most effective way to use this was make the holes first and then just find the holes and cut and X and, turn under the edges and then plant the plugs in there. So this is what they look like when I first started. This is a bare ground plot. Here's the 2 paper plots. And here's what it looked like a few weeks later. But I'll tell you a little bit about weeding. So this was a former pasture, so there was a lot of grass seed in the weed bank. The bare ground plots, this was a few weeks after we planted them. You can see there are some native plants in here, but there's a lot of grass. It took me on average 2 hours and 20 minutes to weed one of these 4 by 6 foot bare ground plots. It was really a pain. And 4 weeks later, there's still, some of these are the native grasses, but there's still some weeds coming up. The plots with the paper, each hole has a native plant in it. And on average, these took 45 minutes, much less time than weeding this because the weeds couldn't come up where there was paper. 4 weeks later, the plants actually are filling in better here than up here. I think it's likely I probably pulled out some of the native grasses when I went through here, but these plots turned out great. And this is what it looks like up close. If you sort of put those little flaps of the paper back, the only places that weeds can grow are right around the plants. So it's a pretty trivial exercise to just bang, 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 go down the row and pull out the weeds. Much easier than this. So I am sold on this paper. Let me just stay on here for a second. But when we tried to do a demonstration plot so that people could see what this looked like in Columbia, I was told that the Columbia Association did not like the paper. They did not like the way it looked, and that they did not think that people would accept the paper. And so they covered the paper, which completely reduced its use, with mulch. Okay, well, fine. They could have planted the plants and put mulch over it. Mulch is almost as effective if you put down 5 inches of wood chips or something like that. Almost as effective as the paper, but not nearly. And the point is, if you put the plants in and you let them grow up so they close the canopy, then you don't get any more weeds and you don't see the paper. So there was a little bit of a difference of opinion there. Most home gardeners, a lot of master gardeners, love the paper because they realize what they're doing. They're saving themselves time. They're not getting weeds. And then the paper deteriorates. If you plant in June, the paper's gone by the fall and you don't need it the next year because it's all, filled in. Okay. We get a combination of climate and watershed benefits from pollinator gardens. And I would love to see more of this in every town, swales filled with native plants down the middle of boulevards, or conservation garden plantings in office parks or in cul-de-sacs. These would just be a big bonus. This slide shows that you can increase biodiversity by mixing your fruits and vegetables into the beds, your landscape beds. This is from a book by Brie Arthur, which is really interesting to read. I don't think I'd be very successful with this because I would forget where the food, different foods are and then forget to harvest them. But it really is beautiful. And she planted some of these things. This is an edge of wheat or barley. She planted a big landscape bed of wheat in her front yard in North Carolina, and the people in her neighborhood loved it. So you can plant edible shrubs, blueberries, raspberries, etc. You can mix veggies with flowers behind the edge, and it can be very effective. I just want to report this news because I'm running out of time. In 2021, Maryland, the legislature of Maryland passed a law that prevents homeowner associations from requiring that front yards include only lawns. And this began as a lawsuit from the people who lived in this house who planted this beautiful native planting in the front yard, which was attacked by a neighbor who wanted lawn and didn't want all these little plants, didn't want to see any other plants but lawn. And this person made a huge fuss with the homeowners association, and there was lawsuits, et cetera. And finally, her representative in the Maryland legislature submitted a bill to prohibit HOAs from requiring that front yards be only lawn. That is a very, requiring lawn in the front yard is very regressive. Okay, it's very climate unfriendly, and the legislature saw this, and the law was passed and signed by Governor Hogan. So, if you live in Maryland, you can, by law, plant native plants in your front lawn, regardless of what your homeowner association says. Okay, however, you need to be a little savvy when you work with your neighbors. First of all, it's important to know the rules. It's important to make your yard fit in, okay? And part of that is to, if you have like a nice big native border like this, is to have a margin of grass, which makes it look like, yeah, somebody's taking care of this, okay? Put in a bird bath or some other what they call cues to care. This lets your neighbors know you're paying attention. It's not just, a lot of people who don't understand plants think, oh, this looks like a vacant lot. Well, this does not look like a vacant lot, and it's reinforced by having this edge. Here's a lawn mimic that hasn't been mowed, but as an edge to a native border. So it's important to share your vision and to reach out to the board, if you want to do this, so that you don't get a lot of hue and cry from the neighbors. And you can even illustrate what you're going to do in your backyard first. But the key is to be enthusiastic and persistent, and stay very positive. And just communicate. There are reasons we're doing this. We want to increase biodiversity. This is we want to reduce climate change. This is important, and it's backed by science. Okay, so the idea is that you can start small. So here's a typical layout in the suburbs: house, a few foundation plantings, a couple of trees, a sort of open plan, no fences, and year by year, you can plant a few more native trees and shrubs around the edge, expand the border with native plants, maybe make a bigger border around your house, maybe put a border along the front. So you're left with a little bit of lawn, to play on or whatever with your dog or your kids, but there's a lot of native habitat here. If you have one of those, if you live in one of those communities where there's, houses that aren't separated by fences, then you can work with your neighbors and get a lot of contiguous habitat, which is really great. I'm going to skip landscaping to reduce energy use and using deep-rooted perennial grasses on stream banks because we're running out of time. So I'll just end by saying that I hope I've conveyed that we can manage our suburban landscapes to reduce emissions, store carbon, and increase biodiversity, plus save time and money. So thank you very much. If you have a question that that you don't have time to ask here in the webinar, you can email me anytime. And I would urge you to check out my webinar recordings and sign up for my newsletter by going to my website, www.climatecorner.org. I've got about 17 or 18 different webinars recorded, and many of them are on biodiversity and landscaping. So, Cynthia, questions?
Wow, a lot, and a lot of questions. But I
Good.
really liked what you said at the very end, and I want people to remember this. Be positive, be enthusiastic, be patient, and be positive. I can't stress enough, be positive, because you're not going to win anybody or any government over by negativity. Be positive. Also, I would like to challenge a lot of you to come up with formal settings using native plants. So often, like you said, Sarah, that there's fields and there's meadows and there's people forget to go back and take care of things. I just talked to a friend of my daughter-in-law, and she thought, oh, I'm just going to plant natives and I'm not going to take care of it after that because they can take care of themselves. And my reply is, why do you think we have professional horticulturists to take care of things? Because there's always work to be done. So just think about how much work that you want to do, but there's always, always an alternative for what our more typical lawns can look like. Encourage people to buy electric. We have electric tools for Smithsonian, and we have solar panels that charge those electric tools. So think about how you can still be presentable and conscious of what you're contributing to climate change. Probably the number one question was, what was the name of the paper again that you use? What was the name?
Weed Guard Plus, or there's Weed Guard and Weed Guard Plus. I think there's a couple of different weights, and if you just Google it, you can find places that sell it. Yeah, there, various seed companies sell it, or probably Amazon doesn't sell that brand, but it does sell some horticultural paper. It's just, to me, it's a lot easier to have it in a roll than to have, a zillion pieces of newspaper, or, a zillion garbage, grocery bags cut up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it just depends on it. But you also brought a good point up for that. So many people use that type of cover and then mulch on top of it.
Yeah.
Remember, mulch breaks down, becomes a type of a soil without minerals, and then weeds can grow in that too. So just be very careful what you do. Think about how much energy you have. I love the way that you said that too. Look at your energy level, your own energy level. What can you do to be able to help keep everything looking good and still be as wild as you want it to be? So I love the last response from one of our viewers saying that she planted a native garden. It is very formal looking, and it has won over her neighbors. Join the HOA. Become the president. That's what I did, so that I could tell people in my neighborhood that this is really acceptable, and I have a positive voice within the neighborhood. Keep doing that. Okay, you asked, or you said something at the very beginning, and I was interested in it as well. Why did the temperature spike in the 1940s?
Oh, geez, I can't remember exactly why. It was one of the, there's in terms of the weather, there are, daily fluctuations, yearly fluctuations, some fluctuations that occur only 10 years, every 10 years or 20 years. And I can't exactly remember what caused it, but that was part of the very dry sequence of years that resulted in the Dust Bowl. Okay, there was a very pronounced dearth of rain in the center of the country, and it was hotter than average. And I don't remember exactly which one of the things caused it, but it sort of is superimposed on that increase of temperature caused by climate change.
Yeah, I think that it's good to recognize that weather is different from climate.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
So that was a weather spike rather than a climate spike.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that there are fluctuations of different interval lengths in the weather. Like there's the El Nino and the La Nina that occurs on one cycle. Then there's the daily weather. Then there's seasonal weather, and so I think a lot of that is more detail than most people want to know. But that's still something which has to do with causes other than the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it wasn't like it warmed up because there were greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and then the greenhouse gases reduced. No, it was a whole different cause of warming in the 40s. So just from climate change point of view, it's sort of extraneous.
Right. And just why is there no data before 1860? Because there's no data before 1860.
Well, also, the Industrial Revolution was really just kind of getting started in the middle 1800s, and there are data on temperature and carbon dioxide that go back 800,000 years. I just didn't show you that.
Yes. Yeah, we have some of that in the Smithsonian ourselves. One of our first secretaries was so interested in weather. He's the one that started gathering data and keeping it on record. And yes, this film or this video is being recorded, and we will make it available after we provide closed captions for the viewers, and it'll be provided on our Smithsonian Gardens Let's Talk Gardens video library. So you'll be able to view it again, share it with your neighbors, share it at your HOA. It's one of the free services that we like to do to be able to have good information out there. That's so important. The other things people have been asking about how to plant things without deer eating them? That's a question. Yeah, I wanted to
I'm
laugh too.
sorry to
Thank you for
laugh.
laughing. I thought a deer will eat anything if they're hungry enough. But if you are persistent and you keep planting, maybe the deer will find something else to eat. But if it's edible, a deer is going to eat it. Even if it isn't edible, a deer may nibble on it. So that's another whole problem that we need to work on in reducing our deer population. So it is 1 o'clock. I want to thank you so very much, Sarah. Your information was so good and so positive, which is what makes me happy. You won't win any friends with by being negative. Be positive. Show them the right way to do things or the most environmentally positive way to be able to take care of things, and we'll go far. So thank you so much. We'll see you later. Bye bye, everyone. Please take the survey. That's important. Bye.
Cynthia, are you copying? Did you copy the chat?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
We're good. So we'll
And
save those questions and I'll share them with you.
yeah, that sounds great. Okay. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye,
Bye
everyone.
bye.